At its core, Fire Emblem is a quite experimental series. Shadow Dragon and Gaiden share very little in common, and while this was not uncommon for other Nintendo series at the time, Fire Emblem would go on to continue iterating on its formula in extremes. Fire Emblem 4 is very different than everything that came before, and Thracia much the same. While Intelligent Systems did enter a period of creative stagnation upon moving to the Game Boy Advance system, I would say that we are in a second golden age of experimentation. Just look at Awakening, Fates, SOV, Three Houses, and Engage and see how many features are unique to just one of those games. Even systems that exist in multiple games, such as Combat Arts and Pair-Up, are fundamentally reworked moving into the sequel. Awakening Pair-Up is quite different from Fates', and Combat Arts and SOV function very differently from Three Houses. The reason I bring this up is the subject of today's review, Fire Emblem Crowns and Thrones, is itself a very experimental ROM hack. While it wears its Fire Emblem 4 inspiration on its sleeves, hosting large maps with multiple objectives and even the FE4 sprite style, to my mind, the most interesting thing that Crowns and Thrones does is its emphasis on generic units who you're not afraid to get killed. In fact, in a large number of ways, the 10 maps of this campaign all exist in sort of pocket dimensions, isolated from each other, and not especially being affected by the decisions you made on the previous maps either. But it is this clever twist that inspires a whole new style of gameplay, and one that I certainly found enjoyable. While the hack's creator themselves says that this will not be an experience for everyone due to the many series traditions that it bucks, I would encourage anyone who's curious how far we can push the series mechanics to check it out, because I think you're pretty likely to have a good time. I think a good starting point for talking about these systems changes is introducing the two types of units, those being generic soldiers and commanders. Generic soldiers, as their name suggests, are unnamed generics in your army, similar to the cavaliers that join with Glade in Chapter 13 of Thracia. You can sacrifice these soldiers without any long-term consequences, and in fact are encouraged to do so, as generic soldiers do not show up on subsequent maps. They are, for all intents and purposes, cannon fodder, and you don't even have to worry about losing their inventory, as items and even money are not carried from map to map. Instead, you have access to a fixed set of items that start in your various units' inventories. Some maps will also feature armories and shops and give you 50 gold to spend on whatever you want. You can choose to purchase a single expensive weapon or multiple cheap ones, or perhaps even some skill or stat boosting rings. It all depends on what you think would be most useful for the situation. And because of the FE4 inspired nature of the maps, you will often end up with two armies on radically different areas of the map. Because gold is shared amongst your entire army, deciding not only what to purchase, but which army to purchase it with is often an interesting tactical decision. But it is not the only give and take that is frequently present in this game, because the Lord units also work in a very interesting way. They are closer to traditional Fire Emblem units, since they are characters you want to stay alive, and they will permanently die if you get them killed. However, unlike traditional Fire Emblem units who emphasize growing and changing over time, the commanders of Crowns and Thrones are for the most part static. Units in this game do not gain experience, nor do they gain weapon rank. You are stuck with the stats and weapon ranks that you have, although those stats are designed to be able to overcome the challenges on the maps that you're facing. Your commanders tend to be amongst the strongest units in your army, sporting very good stats, leadership stars, and often better skills than generics, such as Gale Force or Spur Defense. Additionally, in many instances, your commanders will start out with a Master Seal in their inventory that they can use to promote into one of two promoted classes. Without fail, this is a choice between movement and stats. Like almost all other features, these promotions are not permanent, and instead your commanders will reset to their unpromoted classes upon reaching new maps. At first, it seems like there is a correct choice for each promotion on the map, For example, one group is very far away from the objective and the other one is playing defensively. You want to give stats to the people who are staying still and movement to the units who are far away. But I found that counterintuitively, giving stats to my far away units and rescue dropping them with the generic cavaliers was more successful because I was able to actually punch through the enemies quickly with my super strong general, who would have been much weaker and able to wield not as many good weapons if I made him into a Great Knight. Speaking of the ability to wield weapons, that is another significant change this game makes. I already mentioned the lack of weapon experience, effectively making weapon ranks class-based, similar to Genealogy or Engage. However, there are also only two different ranks, E rank and A rank. This effectively means that some classes are able to wield all weapons, whereas some are only able to wield the weakest. Although which weapons are considered E rank might surprise you. For example, silvers are still an E rank weapon since they're just a generic weapon type, whereas braves or effective weapons are used as A. This helps to keep classes differentiated as well as minimizing the mental load for which classes can use which weapons. And honestly, given this hack's gameplay and map design, it kind of just fits to only have two weapon ranks. I found all of these twists on Fire Emblem's traditional gameplay to be quite nice, and the map design was generally very good as well. Although I did have a few bugbears that itched at me throughout my playthrough and, full disclosure, caused me to drop it right before the final map. The biggest source of frustration by far was the amount of unavoidable RNG that I faced. I played on Lunatic, and almost every enemy had low percentage crit on all of my units, and some of them had high percentage crit on them as well. In many instances, I didn't think this was an issue, and in fact it was additive to the experience, as it encouraged me to use the generic units as frontliners just in case there were random crits that I didn't want my commanders to face. However, there were some situations where losing a specific important generic early on was functionally a reset, and others where commanders themselves had no choice but to face RNG. And in these instances, getting crit would either cause a game over or a commander to permanently die, which the creator states you are highly discouraged from doing. Dead commanders will be replaced with generics, lowering your number of leadership stars, as well as giving you access to fewer good skills, since generic commanders do not have skills. While this is definitely better than simply being down one of your stronger units, it still hurts, especially if you pile up casualties, as the main purpose of your leadership stars is to counteract the leadership stars of the enemy commanders. And speaking of the enemy commanders, at least on Lunatic mode, several of them seemed very overtuned. While their huge balls of stats are clearly intended to have you suicide generics into them to wear them down before your commanders get the finishing blow, I found that many of my generics were actually unable to deal damage to the bosses in chapters 3 and beyond. Instead, I would have to rely on my combat buffed commanders facing shaky hit rates and death in retaliation. I am humble enough to admit that I resorted to save states in multiple instances of chapters 2 and 3, and part of the reason for this was this game does not feature any save points. I know, Danny is once again complaining that not every hack in the universe has save points, but if you're modeling your game after Fire Emblem 4 with the largest maps and most generous save system available, I don't think it's unreasonable for players to expect some manner of checkpoints throughout your very large chapters, especially because elements of the chapters will evolve and change as you accomplish sub-objectives, and it is often unclear in what manner that's going to happen. And to be clear, I don't want everything to be telegraphed. I found getting surprised by a new objective, a new group of enemies, or just a complete inversion of what you're doing on the map to be incredibly fun and feel very much in the spirit of Genealogy. It was probably my favorite part of the map design, when I would accomplish an objective and then learn suddenly, no, the map's not over actually. But it was in equal parts frustrating when either a stray low percentage crit, or an unexpected group of enemies would cause me to reset after 30 minutes of progress. This ultimately is what caused me to quit the game. I had been making save states after each sub-objective, but forgotten to do so on a very late game map and had to redo an entire hour's worth of progress. I didn't feel like sinking that time into a puzzle that I had functionally solved, so I decided to just give up. Which is a shame because I was genuinely interested in seeing where this game's story was going. I don't want to get into heavy spoilers, but the story of Crowns and Thrones follows Prince Leon of the Kingdom of Redgelis, fighting a war for his father, King Richard. As early as the prologue, it becomes incredibly clear that you are fighting on the wrong side of the conflict. This is a similar situation to Fire Emblem Fates Conquest, where your father is an evil aggressor and you are carrying out his orders despite ostensibly being a good person. However, unlike Fates Conquest, this story does not let its protagonist off the hook, and Prince Leon is portrayed both by the narrative and by his allies as a coward for not standing up to his father. Multiple people encourage him to overthrow King Richard, and yet he keeps kicking the can down the road, saying that it's not the correct time to do so. This has consequences both for the land as a whole and Prince Leon's relationships with his subjects, many of whom have motivations that don't fully align with the young prince's. Things get even more complicated when factoring in a couple of guidance from the perspective of the opposing army, as well as the introduction of a second, even slimier protagonist who we immediately learn not to trust because he starts blackmailing someone into being his slave. Personally, I found the writing to be a tad clunky at times, but the substance that was there was very engaging. I didn't really know who I wanted to root for, all I knew is I was interested in seeing what twists and turns would come next. Overall, both from a story and gameplay perspective, I would highly recommend Crowns and Thrones. I may have some issues with it, but it kept me engaged from both a gameplay and story perspective for a very long time, which is something I can't say about every hack I've tried. And if nothing else, it is a whole unique experiment that tells a story with its gameplay perspectives. All of the commanders you're controlling are kind of selfish and willing to let the common people die for the greater good. And if you want to proceed throughout the game successfully, you're going to enable them in doing just that. But speaking of the common people who enable corrupt nobles, my Patreons have been enabling me. I mean, I'm not a corrupt noble, but that's a pretty good transition, right? I'm being enabled to make reviews for a living, that's pretty cool. Thank you to all of my patrons, including Michael Kraus, Len, Gameboo, Karosa, Fyrant, Smazruby, Saxon, Seraphew58, Reflect, Marin McLean, Calamity Callie, Queen Eliza, Adele, Jamie Collins, Mean Jojo, Thick Molder, Danielle Kalaskis, Jagan as a Nest, Julia Kyoto, Arvis, Belwenska, Dysyke, Tailored Muffin, George Grenville the 7th PM, SUP, Caius Cole, Gabe the Green, Control Aegis, Joanna the Wrench Witch, Juniper Junpy, Ginger, and especially my Jagans, Autumn Kelsey and Cynthia. Y'all are what makes my job even possible, and I love it. If you are interested in supporting the channel, there is a link to my Patreon below, which has many benefits like early videos, polls that influence the channel, and some stuff that's too spicy to talk about on YouTube. But please only do so if you can comfortably afford it. I don't want anyone going broke over Fire Emblem. Free ways to support the channel, like liking, commenting, and subscribing, are also appreciated, but regardless of what you choose to do, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.